Yes, hello everyone. My name is Jan. Yeah, Thorsten, the recording is activated, so we can go ahead.
Okay, perfect. So thank you very much again for joining. We're wishing you a good and healthy day. In the beginning, I would ask everybody to please mute your microphones to avoid echo and noise during the webinar. And please turn off your camera so that we have optimal performance for our online training. I hear that there are still some microphones open. It would be great if they could be muted. Thank you. Yeah, so thank you very much for your participation, and thank you very much for your interest in OPC router and especially how to connect ERP systems to other devices. This session will be recorded, so if you would like to review the session or share it with your colleagues, please don't hesitate to turn to your local partners, which you can find on our website, and ask them for the download link. You can also send a direct email to sales@inray.de, and we will also be happy to provide you with the recording. So, in the beginning, just for those of you who might not be too familiar with OPC router already, I will give a very short introduction, a very high level introduction about OPC router, what it does and what it is meant for. And after a few minutes, my colleague Jan will take over and will take you to the training and show you in a live session how to connect SAP and also other ERP systems. So OPC router, what it is and what it does. The name OPC router might be a bit misleading because you might think that it only can communicate via OPC, and router might let you think that it is a hardware router. Both is not correct because OPC router can communicate and connect to almost any IT and OT system. It doesn't have to be OPC as a protocol, and it's not a hardware solution. It's a software-based communication platform. So it's a communication which can be installed on a centralized server or PC, which is connected to the other devices and then transform all the available protocols into the protocol you need. In that case, maybe into a protocol which can speak with your ERP solutions. There are a lot of available plugins coming with OPC router so that you, as said, you can connect almost any kind of system. It doesn't matter if it's an OT system like PLCs or RFID systems, barcode readers, industrial printers, and so on, or if it's more IT systems like clouds, ERP solutions, databases, NoSQL databases, and so on. The special value of OPC router, in my from my perspective, these are there are a lot of added values, but there are two values I think that are peaking out and really differentiating OPC router from any other kind of middleware connectivity or whatever they are called tool. The first one I think is definitely the ease of use, because OPC router is using a graphical user interface so that you can create your connections between different kinds of systems just via drag and drop. And it's really as simple as that. So you will see that in the live demonstration from Jan in about 1 minute. So it's pretty easy to use. You don't need to be an IT expert or an automation expert to understand how to connect to any system. So pretty easy to do. And the other advantage from my perspective is the number of available plugins and supported protocols that OPC router supports. So you don't need different systems to connect your devices. For example, a hardware gateway to connect your PLC and another software tool to connect something to get data into the cloud or whatever. So you can do everything with one single and easy to use software platform. Yeah, before we start with the training, This is a picture we usually use to just explain what kind of connections could be possible with OPC Router. So it doesn't show all available plugins, but yeah, but the most important ones, I think. And it's not only possible to connect devices in one direction, for example, to get data out of a PLC and send it to a database. So of course that's possible. It's a very easy use case, which a lot of customers are using already. But you also can connect several devices at the same time, and you can also implement processes. For example, you can send, if a PLC has the information that a production order has been finished, it can send that information to an ERP system, which can be SAP, Microsoft Dynamics, Navision, Axapta, Infor, and all the other ERP systems, doesn't matter, to inform the ERP system that the production order has been finished. And then the ERP system could send down the data for the new production order to the shop floor, to the PLCs or field systems. And what is also important to ERP users is that the field can give a handshake back through OPC Router to the ERP solution, telling the ERP that the data, the production order, has successfully been transferred to the shop floor and that the production has been started. And then usually when the production starts, there are a lot of other machines and robots and so on included in the production process. For example, there could be a printer located at the packaging line. And so the PLC then could, for example, send some printer information, label information to the printer. And if that printer, for example, should have an issue, for example, because it's running out of ribbon or it's running out of labels or the connection to the printer has failed for any reason, then OPC Router also could recognize that and then send out an email or a telegram message to a maintenance guy. So it's not only communicating from a data source to a data target. As said, you can implement whole processes using these different kinds of available connections and plugins. And this is my last slide, and my colleague Jan will take over in a second. So if you are looking for some information, written information, you can just have a look on our website. So under opc-router.com, you will find for each plugin detailed information. So there's a description for SAP systems. There is also a description for the SAP HANA client that we are offering, and also for the ERP, so web services we are using to connect to any other ERP system, which is not SAP. Yes, you will find some detailed information about the plugins on the website, and you will also find some videos and case studies and everything that explain you what these plugins are able to do. But today you don't have to read. Today my colleague Jan will show you how to do it. So Jan, the stage is yours.
All right. Yeah. Hello, everyone. Once again. Yeah, I will do the presentation about OPC Router. I'm sure I'm sharing my screen right now, so you should be able to see the PowerPoint. And yeah, should be able to hear me. If not, Thorsten, just let me know. So I will go ahead. Our topic today is OPC Router focusing on the plugins SAP and ERP web services. We will be looking at OPC communication as well, but focusing on ERP connectivity. So first of all, we start with SAP and then take a next step on ERP web service plugin. So the first message from regarding the SAP plugin is that we can connect to all available SAP systems. So generally, we have communication to the older system R3, newer system NetWeaver, as well as HANA. So we are, when it comes to SAP, the SAP plugin, we basically, for native communication, when it comes to R3, we install the librfc communication libraries. When it comes to newer SAP version based on NetWeaver, we install the NetWeaver application on the server side where OPC router is running, and it will install the necessary communication libraries from SAP as well. And then we implemented a HANA communication plugin where we directly connect to the SAP HANA database. So there shouldn't be any system, SAP system, that we cannot communicate with. And when it comes to native SAP communication, it's usually 3 different kinds. It's either RFC, it's synchronous bidirectional communication. That means we can create a remote function call on SAP side from OPC router, but SAP can also trigger OPC router and sending data at the same time. So it's bidirectional communication. Second one is BAPI, also more business object related view on programming, kind of object oriented. There we don't have, it's synchronous communication too, but we cannot be triggered from SAP side. And finally, IDO communication. Asynchronous communication, ASCII document based. Here we can also be triggered from the SAP system. Most often used, I think, when it comes to native communication is RFC communication, since the way to SAP and back is easily done, and most SAP programmers are familiar with RFC programming. So then I mentioned the SAP HANA communication. That is also possible, where we connect to the database directly. Certainly, lately we had projects where native communication wasn't that important anymore, but we used SOAP web services when communicating with SAP MII. So that's most often the case in the latest project and the coming projects, I think, as well as RFC native communication. And then finally, of course, RESTful web service communication. An advantage here is that it can be bidirectional too. So in almost all plugins, OPC router is a client, but when it comes to REST or OPC communication, the OPC router can act as a server as well. So in the future, I guess RESTful communication, web service communication, will be implemented more often. So that is the SAP possibilities. And when it comes to other ERP systems, we don't directly have a plugin, but we have, of course, here too SOAP web services, RESTful web service communication, and very often Microsoft SQL Server, simply for let's say interface tables for transaction of interface data. So, but then also from time to time XML-based, file-based communication. So, and that's what we will be looking at now. First, SAP communication, and then in the second step, our ERP web service plugin. And the PowerPoint here, and go straight to the OPC router. For the next half hour, or maybe 45 minutes, I will show you first of all, give you an introduction of the OPC router in general, how you handle it, what it looks like. And then in particular, we will set up connections to SAP and using the ERP web service plugin. So it starts when I open the OPC router. You see the configuration. Basically, the whole application is split into 2 parts. You have the configuration running in Windows user context here. You administrate all the plugins here, so data sources and destinations. You create your connections in the configuration. And at some point, you activate your connections, new connection or changes to a connection. And once you do that, the connections, they are passed to a runtime environment. And the OPC Router runtime environment is running as a Windows service. So it's OPC Router 4 service. It's running in the background, and that is the service that is responsible for executing all the connections. So everything you see here that you set up is stored in a local DB. So if you connect to an OPC Router configuration database, you can use this connection string. Please make sure that you start your Microsoft SQL Server Management Studio as an administrator, and then you would see all the configuration databases. There's only one plugin where you would actually access that database when it comes to template instance connections. Usually you wouldn't touch it. It's just for your information. But when it comes to one plugin, we'll come back later to that, it's template instances, then you have the possibility to insert into that local DB directly into a table, and the OPC router would generate automatically connections from that table and start them. So, but generally it's just that it's a local DB where everything is stored. It starts with a menu here on top. What I usually do when I want to transport connections, I simply export my project. It's then written into a zip file, and on another machine I can just import it. You have some other stuff here like diagnosis for the support team in case you have trouble. Very important log files. When you cannot find out what the problem is, there is a log directory with the files for the configuration as well as the OPC router service. So that should be enough information. You have the settings, basic settings that you start with. When you install it, you may want to change the number of days that transaction data for analysis is stored, because it could blow up your database. So depending on the project, you can change that, as well as the maximum log size, for example. You have automatic project backups specified to a folder and the log levels here. There's nothing to change in the very beginning. Later on, there might be settings up here where you can play with, but yeah, start with the database and the log, and then you should be fine. When we create connections later on, for each connection that you create, you can send an email to a list of participants in case of an error. So the notification under settings here is quite useful to have a look at a certain connection to see if it works properly. And then we have the storage for certificates. So we have our own client certificate or more client certificates here, server certificates for encrypted communication. Many plugins use certificate-based encrypted communication. And finally, some settings for redundancy. An OPC router is running in redundancy mode. Some other important is the manual. You have a manual. Everything that you can configure here is usually explained. And then you have this information where you can, in the beginning or when you have more complex connections, you may want to activate show transfer steps. So the OPC router has a certain execution logic, and here you can see in what order the different transfer objects are executed. So this is very helpful when it comes to complex connections or when you start using OPC router. Finally, the service. This is where you stop the runtime. But for the general everyday handling, you have the icons here on the left side. When I choose them here, then this area here on the left hand it changes depending on the chosen icon. Starts with plugins, so all my data sources and destinations are administrated here. I want to communicate to an OPC server, I need to put in the connection string and credentials. The next step would be creating connections. That's what we are here for today. And then a special kind of connection for creating large amounts of connections and collecting a lot of higher amounts of data is the template instance system. You then, when you create a connection or change it, would choose the Go Productive. So everything that you change or do needs to be set productive manually here by this button. And once you do that, it's passed to the runtime. The state here, it's the last icon, it gives you an overview about your connections and if you're running into errors or not. So it's basically the analysis part. But it starts up here. So the first step, of course, is you have to administrate your sources and target systems. I start with my SAP systems. When I double click it, I have one SAP system. It's our test system here, older system R3 based. When I double click it, there's a dialog coming up. And the first thing is that you ask your customers, of course, always you give a good name when this is the working name within OPC Router. But then when the customer comes and asks for SAP communication, the first question is what version he's running. Is he using RFC communication, RFC protocol, legacy protocol, based on the lib 32 libraries? Or is it using the newer one? Then they install the NetWeaver communication libraries in order to do it. And then you have some information that you get from the SAP administrator, also load balancing if they have a load balancing server. But basically that's the decision that's the information you need to ask for. Of course, security, if you just have basic communication, then you have a user and a password. You get that from SAP Administrator too. You can have encrypted communication, certificate-based encrypted communication. So that would be the next question to ask. And then you just configure it accordingly. We have experience with many SAP system connected projects during the last year. So in case there are problems, you can certainly refer to us for more information, but that should be fine. And you have, of course, when you're using a NetWeaver communication, you would use Unicode. In R3, for example, here, I use non-Unicode based communication. And you always, as I said, have the manual on SAP. So for each configuration point, you have some explanation. So you should be fine. It's not very difficult to set it up. So and then finally, of course, you can always test it. And now the connection is established. So I can use my SAP system here on my side. Next thing would be, okay, I need OPC data. So I have a CAP server configured here using UA communication. And I just supply, of course, a name again and the connection string. And then I'm using encrypted communication anonymous logon. And then, of course, you can check it again. And then when you do it, you have communication to a UA server. Web services, I'll just go ahead to that too. You just put in the necessary data. But once you have done that, we'll have a look at it later, then you're fine. So the administration is now done for the purpose of this webinar. There are other plugins here, like just quickly MQTT communication, where we are publisher subscriber. We need a broker. We have predefined profiles for the bigger companies that help you to set it up when it comes to certificate exchange and so on. So it's optimized on bigger companies, but you can also use a Mosquito on your local machine. We have REST, different here. OPC Router usually is a client, but here it can be a server. So you can create a RESTful application. And when the second part would be here OPC UA server. So OPC router, originally only a UA and DA OPC client, can also act as an OPC UA server. Then some industry specific for mechanic tooling, molding company industry, some device specific diary industry. We have the relational databases that we can connect to. Some non-SQL database types like influx time series based for large amounts of data, becoming more and more interesting. MongoDB for document oriented. And we have a network file access. So still people send files around the world. So we have implemented it too. And you have FTP, SMB encrypted communication, as well as coming soon HTTP in some of the next releases. So, and then some internal variables. That's not so important at the moment, but when it comes to OPC UA server, variables are very useful. You can script your own plugins, transfer objects, as well as triggers, your own functionality in C#. We have emailing. You can send emails around, and the Telegram messenger, like WhatsApp, so Telegram messenger, as well as some printer. General for using the driver on the local machine where OPC router is installed. Generic TCP communication, so you build the protocol of the printer with using ASCII control signs and then the label data, and then some help with some industry, vendor specific printers. But we are focusing on SAP and ERP web services. So I start with SAP. I switch to the next icon. This is connections. So I would create folders and connections here. So I start, say, my folder name is SAP. Within that folder, I want to create a connection. And this is SAP RFC call. So I will call a remote function on SAP side. I, first of all, need the SAP objects that I want to use. In this case, we're using RFC. You can also have BAPI or IDOC. SAP, RFC and BAPI are by asynchronous communication. RFC is also bidirectional, and IDOC is asynchronous communication, but also bidirectional. So SAP can trigger us. We will use some RFC that my colleague Andrea programmed. So when I drag the transfer object here, this section is my workbench where you create everything. Everything is always organized in tabs. So I double click on the RFC transfer object, choose the SAP system. Then I need to filter, so I don't browse the whole SAP system. I filter for the specific functions. And there's one function group that contains some functions. And here's one that Andrea created, a production data or recipe data based on a product ID. So when I choose the function, I can go to the parameters tab and then see I have some import and export parameters. So that are defined within that method. So SAP claims a product ID, and in return, it would give me some information. It can be a table, so you get a whole table or filler table. It can be a structure or simple data fields. So I have a message here from the structure, and then some data fields like width, length, error code, what color number. And when I say OK, then I have the transfer object here. So I provide a product ID using OPC access. So I choose an OPC transfer object. My OPC server is the CAP server on my local machine. And when I browse it, I have one machine using a CAPware simulation suite, since I'm not running a real PLC. And for that purpose, I have set up a product ID here. So I double click on it, and it would add that OPC tag or item on my in my list here. then I say OK, and now I can just match it here by drawing this connection to the next transfer object. So when I've done that, in return, I get some information from SAP, and I want to write that on an OPC server again. So I have some target data here where, yeah, let's say I put the error code, error message, color, length, and width, I think. So when I double click it, then they are added here. And now I can either, draw connection lines, or I have some intelligence up here, making a match by name. So constantly or only for this step, I will create multiple connections. So I activate the sort of intelligence. I I mark the return message and put it, let's say here. And then based on the name, OPC Router would do the rest for you. So when you have a lot of files to draw, that option up here is quite nice to use. So this would be my first connection. I have in step 1, I'm reading a product ID from an OPC server, make a remote function call. In return, I get the information from SAP and write it back to an OPC server. Missing is only, the last thing is a trigger. So at some point, this connection needs to be fired. So I define a message trigger here. So when I use it and I say, OK, cap server UA, I define some handshaking data. So I have a 32-bit integer here that is changing constantly. Whenever I change it, the OPC router will realize that it has changed and will fire my connection. Always, I will in return tell the PLC or OPC server the value that he sent me. So when he starts with 23, OPC router realizes 23 is not known. The last number was 22. It would fire my connection and write back the 23. So the PLC knows message was received. This is sort of a standard approach that we use when communicating with PLCs. So that would be it. I have 3 transfer objects and a trigger. So when I show transfer steps, when I take it away, I don't have the order, so the sequence. And when it comes to larger connections, many transfer objects, this is quite helpful to have the execution sequence. For example, when I have another database object here, it would be in step 5. But when I put it up here, it's step 2. So the execution logic is from left to right and top bottom. Yeah, so when I've done that, I can either use this shortcut up here or on the left hand to set it productive. It's not passed to the runtime. The runtime is empty in connections. It's only in the configuration. So I check it and say, go productive. And then it will start the service in this case. Whenever you don't do changes to the plugin, but only to the connection, it wouldn't start the service. It would only affect the connection that you made changes to, but not all the other connections. Since I made some changes to the SAP plugin, it would restart the service. And then at some point, you can switch to the state, which is looking at the OPC router runtime. And it will now initialize, connect to the message trigger item and realize that it changes at some point and then fire my connection. So now it's starting, and you can see I get a product ID here by 40, make the remote function call, and return I get some values, and I write it back to the OPC server. So yeah, and then up here you see in the transfer chart for each transfer, when I choose this one, it will show me the values that were transferred to that point of time, just for analysis purposes. When you run into errors, then this becomes more helpful, then you can see what the problem is. So that would be the first example. If there aren't any questions, I would continue with the RFC trigger. So I switch back to connections. And within the same folder, I say RFC trigger. Since the communication is bidirectional, so SAP can trigger us too, I can go down here and have two kinds of triggers, IDOC or RFC. So I would choose an RFC trigger. And when I double click on it, and in the following dialog, I need to choose the SAP system, of course. Then a program ID, I just say OPC router, that needs to be the same registered on SAP side under that name. The gateway service is a port. Usually it's the same as in the plugin settings, but could be different. So this is something you get from your SAP consultant. This is something you agree on, and then the function name, of course, as well. Let's say product data needs to be capital. So I defined a function, and basically what you do is you go to the manual, have a look at what this is. So when it comes to the program ID, and you tell the SAP consultant that this is a transaction of SM59, he would know what you mean. The gateway service then is, yes, it's a port for the communication. And then the function name itself is something you define. And then you have to make sure that the SAP consultant uses this way in order to trigger or call your function. Because the OPC router is registering at the SAP system as an SAP system itself. And this way, using the gateway and the program and the function name, the SAP programmer can trigger us. So this is just, communication, good communication to the SAP consultant, and you should be fine. And I think it is, explained clearly here. So, with an example. So this needs to be capital letter trigger function, and then with an example here. And it should work directly. You can then define, of course, you have input and output parameters for your function. What you can do is you can receive and send data. The data you can get, for example, is different types of parameters of the function, of different type, data type. For char, for example, I have to specify the length. But I can also have structures that consist of different data fields. And I can have whole tables. So whenever they call my function and to trigger me, they can at the same time send me data. They can also send me a whole table, for example, for production data. And you would receive that data and then do whatever with it, store it to a database or whatever with OPC router. So this is a very helpful tool. You can also access functions here on SAP side for several structures. You can just load it. The OPC, the SAP consultant would give you a name, and then you have access to that table already and can import it. So there's a quite good way to communicate to SAP and at the same time get triggered and receive information. So in this case, it was a table that I'm getting, could be many, many rows, sort of array oriented. And you can do whatever with it now. I don't have access to the SAP system to trigger me actually, but should be quite easy to set it up. So this would be the SAP communication. I would deactivate it here to continue with ERP web services. So whenever you deactivate a connection, it's now deactivated in the configuration, but it's not in the runtime. So you always have to go here and set it productive. And, oh, I selected services up here. That was a mistake. So now it's also deactivated in the runtime. That would be the example for SAP. So if there are any questions, I will continue using web services.
There's one question.
Yeah.
If the client or the customer already has installed PI or PO middleware providing a SOAP adapter, is the SAP plugin still necessary? Or do we use the web services connector instead?
That is a good question. The Pico, is that the software that is meant, right? I think. Well,
I'm not sure if Pico is meant or if it's a software or tool called PI/PO.
Okay, I'm not familiar with that, unfortunately. Well, in general, what you can do is, and you can communicate with that PI module using web services, SOAP-based or REST-based, or maybe OPC. So I'm not really able to answer that. We would have to receive an email and dive into it in more detail in another meeting.
Okay.
Okay. Okay, so next step would be ERP web services. I'll create a folder for it, and when I say new connection here, I would just want to create a connection again to a web service. When I hit enter, then it's a new tab, empty connection here, and the ERP web service module is SOAP-based communication. You give it a name again, and then a URL. The WSDL file that the OPC router receives contains all, in XML format, all the available methods as well as input and output parameters of that web service, and it will show it to you in a transfer object. Then you can use it as regular using connection lines. So you may have an endpoint to that web service, but first of all, you have this URL. You can have encrypted communication. In this case, I don't. And then, of course, user login data. So this is just a web-based web service that we are using for this purpose. And it looks like this. You have the web service, and when I create a call, I can only call a web service. I cannot create a SOAP-based web service, only REST. So it's one directional in OPC Router. But since I want to call one, I choose from the plugin my SOAP web service, and OPC Router would read all the XML file, parse it, and give you back all different methods that are available. So in this case, I want to get product information, so I choose it. I have input parameters, and in return, when I supply a product ID, it would give me any information about a product. So kind of like the same as the recipe example in SAP. So here I just say okay. So now I have all the parameters here. Maybe in this case, I don't want to use a regular OPC communication, but for example, I want to have a trigger using OPC method. So, oops, that was too much. So I want an OPC UA client to connect to me using OPC Router OPC server functionality and supply a product ID. Then I just put it somewhere in a JSON format and reply with an output parameter of type string. So this is where we use the server functionality of OPC Router. So I implemented an OPC server, the server path for the methods, something I defined in the plugin settings too. Then I give it a name, product info, or product data. And it supplies product information. So my input parameter is the product ID that I pass to the web service. It's of type, let's say, integer. And the output is product information or data. This is of type string. So now my method is defined. It's visible for all UA clients. I supply the product ID, and in return, I put some information into a JSON. So my JSON transfer object, I double click it. It's an empty JSON here. I can also copy it in, but here I do it manually. So my first product name, let's say. This is of type value. I have product number, also of type value, and price maybe, or safety level. I think that was filled, and also of type value. So in the background, this object, JSON object with 3 elements, 3 values is created. Now I choose those I want to use. In this case, it's all of them. So they added up here. Leave the name as it is for this purpose, say OK. And then I just put the name here, the number here, and some safety level here. It would create, so I call the client calls me, supplies a product ID, I call the web service. In return, I get the information, put it into a JSON, and then return it into the response parameter of the method to the UA client. So I activate it again, and it's marked already, and say go productive. And then it starts. At some point it will be here. So for the web service example, it needs to set up my local OPC server. And once it's done, I can choose the UA expert. So I go to servers. I have the root OPC server here, and I say OK. Let's see if it's up and running already. So I haven't trusted the certificate. I do that now. And now I have encrypted communication, and then in return it gives me data from the OPC router, all kinds of data that I can use. So I created some OPC tags and my method, the product data. And I can just call that method and I supply a product ID and say call. Then at some point it will return information to me. So the information should be a JSON. Put it to a text file, and it contains all the data. And in OPC router status, I see there was a call, and then for the 40, the web service was called, and in return I got the parameters, put them in a JSON write and back to the method. So this is an example where you can use OPC router server functionality. And at the same time, how you use web services. Basically, you supply a WSDL file and you're fine. So that would be the examples from my side. So we can switch now back to Torsten and go ahead with the questions. Or let us know if you want to see something else.
Thanks, Jan. Are there any questions? If yes, you can unmute your microphone or just type your question into the chat.
I think Murilo would like to ask something. He raised his hand.
Torsten, I don't understand because there is the number 2. I didn't find the number 1 and the number 4 on the sequence in what Jan was doing. Very strange, this thing. You have only 2, 3, and 5. Where's the number 1 and number 2?
That's a good question. Yeah, well, usually it's safe for the trigger, so the 1 is not used anymore. But yeah, 4 maybe because it's a loop, you wouldn't usually see that. Only when using REST or OPC server functionality, you can create a loop with the transfer objects. So seems to be because of that.
Okay. Thank you very much. Very interesting demonstration. Very, very interesting. Anytime you show this trigger methods, it looks like I learned something new on how to use OPC router better. These method triggers, they hide a lot of smartness. Thank you very much for showing this to us.
Thanks, Murilo, for participating and asking the question.
Yeah,
okay.
Thank you. Well, that's something we experience too when it comes to REST communications, particularly that OPC router is able to be really a data hub. It can be a central communication platform and then distributing the data, not only OPC as a client. So that's true. We experience that more and more.
Okay, so if there should be no other questions, I think we can stop the recording now. The recording is available, so please ask your local distributor, like for example, Murilo from